Thanks for tuning in to Operation Revenge. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin the story. The room smelled like polished wood and expensive perfume. Every seat was filled, the crowd whispering in half a dozen languages. I sat in the third row from the back, my dark suit blending into the sea of diplomats and officials. No one looked twice at me, and that was the point. I'd spent over a decade perfecting the art of being invisible. My name is Aria Morton. I'm 36 years old. Most people who know me think I do research for an international think tank based in Washington, D.C. In reality, I'm the Whisperer, a covert crisis negotiator for the Global Peace Consortium. My work has kept wars from erupting, saved hostages, and dissolved blockades. But my name has never been attached to a single victory, not even in secret reports. That anonymity was my armor. And yet tonight, it felt fragile. My father, Victor Morton, sat near the front. He was easy to spot. Rigid back, military uniform pressed to perfection, rows of medals shining under the chandelier lights. A retired commander, Victor spent my entire life reminding me that what he did, fighting, bleeding, sacrificing, was what mattered. Your work is soft, he'd told me more than once. It doesn't change the world. Real change comes from the battlefield. I swallowed hard when I saw him nodding to the man beside him, probably assuming I wasn't anywhere in the room. He thought he was here to support an old comrade being honored. If he knew the truth, he'd probably still roll his eyes. The ceremony began. A French diplomat spoke of unsung heroes, of the power of quiet negotiation. My pulse quickened. I kept my gaze low, hoping no one would notice me. I wasn't ready for this, for any of it. Then the lead official walked to the microphone. His voice was firm, almost solemn, as he said, "We need the Whisperer in here." The room stirred with whispers and shifting chairs. Heads turned. My stomach tightened. I stood slowly, the fabric of my suit catching the light, and stepped into the aisle. Every movement felt heavy, deliberate. I had walked into hostile rooms with warlords and armed guards without flinching. But this was different. The moment I started down the aisle, people rose to their feet. A standing ovation, low murmurs of recognition. None of them knew my name, but they knew my work. It was the kind of acknowledgement I had never sought, but now couldn't avoid. I glanced at my father. He had turned halfway in his seat, eyes wide, his expression stiff with disbelief. I saw the exact second it clicked, that his own daughter, the one he dismissed as soft, was the Whisperer, the legend whispered about in briefing rooms, the force behind peace treaties and negotiated surrenders. I walked past him, feeling the weight of his stare. For once, Victor Morton had no words, neither did I. I simply stood at the front as the applause quieted, and for the first time, I let the world see me. Silence was the default setting of my childhood home. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, loaded kind that pressed on your chest and made you feel small. My father, Victor Morton, believed that a house was meant to run like a military unit, quiet, disciplined, and efficient. Anything else was weakness. When I was a kid, I learned early that laughter or noise didn't belong there. My mother, Eleanor, had been sick for as long as I could remember, her body frail and her voice barely above a whisper. Most days, she stayed in the back bedroom with the blinds half closed. If I crept in to sit beside her, I'd read from my dog-eared books just to fill the emptiness. She would smile faintly, but her strength faded quickly, leaving me alone with the hum of the oxygen machine. My father wasn't cruel in the physical sense, but his words had weight like lead bullets. He measured people by what they could endure, medals, scars, and how well they obeyed orders. He didn't understand books or languages, and he didn't care to. Soft things, he called them. Useless hobbies. When I turned 12, I tried to impress him. I had been teaching myself French, using a stack of worn cassette tapes I'd found at a garage sale. I spent weeks practicing simple sentences, mouthing the words late at night when no one could hear. One morning, I greeted him at breakfast with my best attempt. "Bonjour, papa. Comment ça va?" He looked up from his newspaper, his fork frozen mid-air. For a second, I thought he might smile. Instead, he snorted. "That won't get you anywhere in life. The world doesn't care if you can chat in French. You need skills that matter." The heat rose to my face, and I sat there pretending his words didn't sting. But I remember pushing my plate away, my appetite gone. He'd just confirmed what I already suspected, that anything I loved, anything that didn't fit his idea of strength, would always be dismissed. So I stopped telling him about the things that made me happy. I stopped sharing anything at all. In the quiet of my room, I built a different world. I collected language tapes, secondhand dictionaries, and notebooks filled with scribbled phrases. I bought a cheap shortwave radio with babysitting money and stayed up listening to crackling voices from faraway places. Each language I picked up felt like a key to another life, a rebellion against the silence he forced on me. I taught myself bits of Arabic, Russian, and Spanish, stringing together words and tones until I could almost imagine myself somewhere else. Every phrase I learned was a secret victory. I didn't have medals or scars to show, but I had words, thousands of them, tucked into my notebooks like treasures. When I whispered them to myself at night, it felt like I was unlocking doors my father could never close. Looking back now, I think that silence shaped me as much as any of my studies. It taught me how to listen, how to find meaning in what wasn't being said, and in its own way, it made me strong. Just not the kind of strong my father ever wanted. The acceptance letter from the University of Pennsylvania arrived in a heavy white envelope. I remember holding it with trembling hands, my pulse racing as I read the words, "Full scholarship granted." It was my first tangible proof that all those late nights with notebooks and language tapes had been worth something. I carried the letter into the kitchen where my father sat with his morning coffee. "I got in," I said, unable to hide my smile. They offered me a full ride to study cultural diplomacy. He didn't look up from his newspaper. After a long pause, he gave a single grunt. "Diplomacy? That's just talk. Talking never won a war." The word stung, but I swallowed my disappointment. I'd learned by then that expecting praise from him was like expecting warmth from a stone. I slipped the letter back into its envelope and told myself I didn't need his approval. At school, I poured every ounce of energy into my studies. I devoured books on political theory, history, and cross-cultural communication. My professors noticed my obsession with detail, the way I dissected gestures, pauses, and tones of voice like they were part of a secret code. "You don't just hear people," one of them said. "You read them." During my second year, I joined a simulation exercise where students played the roles of negotiators, resolving an international crisis. Most participants stumbled through the scripted lines, but I went off script, listening for patterns and small tells. By the end, even the visiting diplomats observing the exercise took notice. "She's got an ear for tension," one of them said. I remember feeling like I had found the one place where my odd childhood skills, silence, observation, patience, finally made sense. After graduation, I was invited to a closed-door interview with the Global Peace Consortium, GPC, an organization that operated in the gray zones between governments, where official channels failed. The interview lasted 7 hours. They asked me to mediate a mock hostage crisis in 3 languages. I walked out exhausted, but I got the call 2 days later. I was in. My early missions were shadow work. No titles, no credit. I sat in dusty rooms in Eastern Europe, listening to men with guns argue over land and grudges older than I was. I diffused standoffs by noticing the smallest things. A glance, a twitch of the jaw, a hesitation before a word. Each time I succeeded, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing lives had been saved, even if no one would ever say my name. Back home, I'd call my father, hoping maybe I could share something, anything, about my work. But he'd cut me off with the same dismissive tone. "Still working in that office of yours?" he'd ask. To him, if it wasn't combat, it wasn't real. I stopped trying to explain. My victories would remain invisible, and maybe that was how they were meant to be. The mission in North Africa was supposed to be routine as peace talks between 2 armed factions could ever be. My team and I were set to meet with local intermediaries in a dusty border town, a place where even the air tasted of distrust. We'd prepared for every variable. Double-blind routes, encrypted communications, safe houses ready in case things turned ugly. I had done dozens of operations like this before, where anonymity was not just an advantage, but a shield. But that shield cracked in a single radio transmission. We were halfway to the meeting point, the vehicle bumping over uneven terrain, when a voice crackled over the enemy's frequency. My real name. Not my alias, not my code name, but Aria Morton. It felt like ice water poured down my spine. My teammates froze. One of them muttered, "How the hell do they know that?" Minutes later, an explosion ripped through the lead car. The convoy scattered, dust and chaos everywhere. I scrambled out of the back seat, my mind racing faster than my heartbeat. We were ambushed, and someone had made sure I was the target. I made it out alive. Barely. We lost 2 vehicles and one local contact who never saw it coming. By the time I was extracted, my cover had been shredded and the mission was officially declared compromised. At headquarters, I was pulled into a gray-walled briefing room, facing a panel of stone-faced officials. "We have reason to believe," one of them said carefully, "that there was an internal security failure. Your name was in a classified clearance file connected to an older encryption protocol. Until we understand what happened, you are suspended from all field operations." Suspended. Just like that. Years of fieldwork reduced to a single suspect line in a report. I didn't believe in coincidences. Something about the breach felt deliberate. The digital trail I traced after hours was faint, but pointed to an encrypted key, one registered years ago to a security project my father had overseen during his final military consultancy days. The file was old, buried under layers of bureaucracy, but the connection was undeniable. I stared at his name on the screen. Victor Morton, Security Oversight Officer. My chest tightened. Did he even know? Or worse, did he ignore some flaw because it didn't seem important at the time? The thought of him being indirectly tied to my near death made my stomach twist. Officially, I was supposed to let the GPC's internal investigation handle it. Unofficially, I couldn't just sit still. I started pulling logs, scraping old archives, and piecing together a timeline in secret. Every discovery was another needle of betrayal. I remembered the way he used to brush off my career, telling me it didn't matter. What if, in some small, careless way, he'd proven himself right? I made myself a promise that night. I would find out the truth, even if it meant uncovering something I didn't want to see. I couldn't rely on anyone else to clean up this shadow. It was my name, and my life, on the line. I spent weeks combing through encrypted archives, piecing together a chain of approvals like a puzzle no one wanted solved. The breach in North Africa hadn't been random. The digital fingerprints were too clean, too deliberate. With the help of Jalen, a trusted tech analyst I'd worked with for years, I dug into old security contracts that most people had long forgotten. "This protocol," Jalen said one evening, tapping a line of code on his screen, "was signed off by a private consultancy 8 years ago. The encryption key that failed you, it traces back here." He pulled up the name of the consultancy, Morton Strategic Advisory. My breath caught. Morton, my father's name. Victor had served as a consultant after his military retirement, often advising on security systems for various agencies. It wasn't direct proof that he'd caused the breach, but it was enough to tell me that someone in his circle had failed to protect the very codes I trusted with my life. I leaned against the table, staring at the screen. Was it negligence or something worse? I asked quietly. Jalen glanced at me, unsure if he should answer. We both knew I was really asking if my father had known. Instead of going public, I submitted an anonymous packet to the GPC's Oversight Committee, detailing the compromised protocols and attaching every shred of evidence. I left out Victor's name, but included the consultancy's full records. It didn't take them long to escalate the matter quietly. The higher-ups wanted answers. 2 weeks later, an invitation landed on my desk, a formal recognition ceremony in Geneva. It wasn't just for me. Several honorary advisors, including Victor Morton, had been invited. The same man who had spent years mocking my work would now be seated in the front row, as I was finally acknowledged. The irony made me almost laugh. I prepared for that event the way I prepared for negotiations, not with speeches or grand gestures, but with silence and readiness. I wasn't looking to humiliate him, but I needed him to see, with his own eyes, that I had carved my own path, one he neither built nor believed in. The day before the flight, Jalen called me. "You sure you don't want the committee to confront him directly?" With what we found, they could. "No," I said. "This isn't about revenge. He'll know the truth when it matters." As I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt since the ambush. Control. My father would walk into that event thinking he knew who deserved the spotlight, and I would be there, not as his daughter chasing his approval, but as the whisperer, the woman he had unknowingly underestimated her entire life. The stage was set. The hall in Geneva felt almost unreal, like a place where time had been slowed down to match the weight of the moment. Rows of dark suits and military uniforms lined the seats. Golden light from the chandeliers reflected off polished metals and gleaming nameplates. I sat 3 rows behind my father, deliberately invisible, my plain suit blending into the background. The opening speeches were polite and vague, full of phrases like unsung heroes and quiet victories. My father sat tall and still, the rigid posture of a man who believed he knew exactly who those words were meant for: the soldiers, the commanders, the real warriors. He didn't turn around, not once. Why would he? He couldn't imagine that I'd be here for anything more than an administrative role, if he even guessed I was in the room at all. Then the lead diplomat approached the podium. He looked over the crowd with calm authority before speaking into the microphone. "We need the whisperer in here." The 6 words rolled across the room like a command, silencing every murmur. People turned in their seats. Some stood, craning their necks. My heart pounded as I rose, my shoes echoing softly against the floor. I walked into the aisle, and the whispers grew louder, not of confusion, but recognition. Faces that had never seen me before now seemed to know exactly who I was. Stories of the Whisperer had circulated for years in quiet rooms and encrypted reports, but no one had ever connected that name to a face until now. I stepped forward, and something strange happened. The entire hall stood. It wasn't applause. It was quiet, almost reverent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. I caught my father's expression when I passed him. At first, he didn't move. His eyes followed me, narrowing slightly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then realization hit, and I watched his jaw tighten, his hand resting against the edge of his chair like it needed something solid to hold on to. He had no words, no dismissive comments ready this time. I reached the front, facing the crowd. I didn't give a speech. I didn't need to. My presence was enough, a truth laid bare, a life's work no longer hidden. Behind me, I felt my father's gaze like a weight on my back. For the first time, I think he understood who I had become, and who I had always been. The ceremony ended with the sound of soft applause, but most of the room stayed silent, as though clapping would break the weight of what had just been revealed. People gathered in small groups, whispering. I could feel their eyes on me, some curious, some skeptical, others simply stunned to know that the mysterious whisperer was a woman who had spent years avoiding the spotlight. Not all the whispers were kind. Does anyone even know what she's actually done? I overheard one official mutter to another. Could be just a PR move. Another voice added, I've heard stories. She supposedly negotiated a ceasefire in the Balkans, but no one's seen the reports. I didn't respond. I'd learned a long time ago that silence can speak louder than explanations. A few veterans approached me, men who had been in rooms I'd negotiated behind the scenes. She's the real thing, one of them said firmly, loud enough for others to hear. We wouldn't have walked out alive if it weren't for her work in Beirut. Slowly, the doubts began to quiet down, replaced by nods of respect. But Victor didn't come near me. I watched him slip out of the hall, his uniform still stiff, his face unreadable. He hadn't said a word since realizing who I was. For a moment, I wondered if he would even acknowledge me after this, or if the truth of my life's work had simply unsettled the version of the world he wanted to believe in. 3 days later, I got a message from him. No greeting, no explanation, just one line. If I confess my oversight, would you expose me? I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the screen. He wasn't just talking about the breach. He was talking about years of stubborn pride, of dismissing me because I hadn't chosen the path he deemed worthy. I typed one simple reply. No, I didn't offer forgiveness, but I didn't need to punish him either. For the first time, I felt the balance between us shift. The man who once believed he could define my worth was now asking for my judgment, and I wasn't giving him the power to shape my answer. That night, I sat in my apartment and thought about everything. The ambush in North Africa, the evidence I had quietly handed over, the way the room had stood for me in Geneva. I didn't need his validation anymore, but I couldn't deny that part of me had waited for this, for him to finally see me, not as the soft child with a book in her lap, but as the woman who had survived and built a world of her own. The message from my father came early on a Monday morning, though not in the way I expected. It wasn't a call or an apology, just a forwarded notice from GPC's ethics division. Victor Morton had requested a voluntary hearing. My chest tightened as I read the brief, review of past security authorizations and breaches. A week later, I sat quietly at the back of the panel room while my father took his seat in front of the committee. The man who had spent his life commanding rooms now looked smaller, as though the weight of his medals and titles had finally settled on his shoulders. He admitted, with no hesitation, that years ago, He had approved a flawed encryption system through a private consultancy he oversaw. His voice was steady, but stripped of pride. "I thought it was secure," he said. "I was wrong. People could have died because of my oversight." There was no dramatic fallout, no raised voices. The panel thanked him for his honesty and confirmed what I already knew. He would lose his remaining advisory roles. The record would note his mistake, but my name would remain untarnished. When he left the room, our eyes met briefly. He didn't speak, but the look he gave me was one I had never seen before. Not disappointment or command, but something like humility, maybe even respect. 2 days later, a small package arrived at my apartment. Inside was a faded military medal, its ribbon frayed at the edges. No letter, no note, just the medal. I held it in my palm for a long time, feeling the weight of a lifetime's worth of silence between us. It wasn't an apology. It was something quieter, his way of saying he finally saw me. I realized then that legacy isn't measured in medals, speeches, or applause. It's in the moments no one sees, the choices we make when no one is watching. For years, I had been running missions in the shadows, believing my worth depended on staying there. But that day, I knew it was time to build something lasting, something that didn't require me to hide anymore. I handed in my resignation for fieldwork a month later. No fanfare, no drawn-out goodbye. Just a simple note. It's time for others to learn to listen. The GPC offered me a position overseeing training and cultural intelligence, a role that would let me shape new negotiators for the next decade of challenges. I accepted without hesitation. It wasn't about stepping back. It was about stepping into a different kind of strength, one that didn't need the shadows to have meaning. The new office smelled faintly of fresh paint and paper, the kind of scent that carries a sense of beginning. My title plate read, Director of Cultural Intelligence Training. But the brass plaque on my door bore something else entirely, engraved in quiet, bold letters. The Whisperer Room. I hadn't asked for that. My colleagues said it was the least they could do, a nod to the years I'd spent working in silence for outcomes few would ever know. Inside, I created something I had always wished I'd had, a place where voices weren't judged by how loud or commanding they were, but by how well they listened. We called it the Listening Lab. Recruits came from all over the world, carrying their own assumptions of diplomacy, that it was about clever words, flashy strategies, and strong personalities. The first thing I taught them was how to be quiet. Negotiation, I told them on the first day, starts with silence. People reveal everything in what they don't say, in the spaces between their words. That's where trust begins. Some of them struggled. I'd watch them squirm, wanting to fill every pause with reassurance or a well-placed argument. But slowly, I saw them begin to understand the value of waiting, of reading a room the way I once read my father's unspoken moods across the dinner table. One afternoon, a young officer named Samuel stayed behind after a session. He was nervous, but there was a sincerity in his voice that reminded me of myself years ago. "Is it true?" he asked. "Are you really the Whisperer?" I smiled, not with pride, but with a kind of quiet amusement. "What does it matter?" I asked him. "The name doesn't belong to a person. It belongs to an idea, that the smallest voice, used well, can hold the most power." He nodded, looking thoughtful. That was enough of an answer. A few weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail with my father's handwriting on it. For a moment, I just stared at it, unsure if I was ready to open whatever waited inside. When I finally tore it open, I found no apology, no attempt to rewrite the past. Instead, there was an old photograph of me as a child sitting on the porch with my mother, a book open on my lap. On the back, written in his unmistakable block letters, were 6 words: "You changed the world your way." I sat there for a long time, holding that photo. It wasn't forgiveness or redemption. It was something quieter, something that mattered more. Acknowledgement. Maybe even love, the only way he knew how to give it. As I placed the photo on my desk, I realized I no longer needed his validation, but having it, at last, felt like closing a door on years of doubt. The Whisperer Room wasn't just a title. It was the sum of every silence I had endured, every voice I had learned to hear, and every choice I had made when no one else believed in me.